July 18, 1946, Kapustin Test Range, Kazakhstan SR. Engineer Mikhail Gurevich knelt in the fine, sun-baked dust of the steppe. His calloused fingers traced a smooth, curved edge of metallic disc, 6 meters in diameter, its surface polished to a mirror finish that reflected the cloudless sky. The disc rested on 3 telescoping landing gear, each strut wrapped in protective canvas to prevent dust from jamming the hydraulics. Behind him, a team of 6 technicians huddled around the craft's small central cockpit, their hands adjusting thin copper wires connected to a panel of dials. Gurevich flipped open his leather-bound clipboard, comparing the disc dimensions to a set of yellow blueprints tucked under his arm. The blueprints, stamped with faded swastikas and German technical notations, had been pried from a lock safe in a Nazi research lab in Breslau 8 months earlier. This was Projekt Lyra's first prototype, the Soviet Union's attempt to turn a failed Nazi flying saucer design into a weapon that could outmaneuver any Allied fighter. He checked his pocket watch, 9:07 a.m. In 13 minutes, test pilot Pyotr Nesterov would climb into the cockpit, and the team would learn that the saucer could even stay airborne for more than 10 minutes. It was a moment of quiet tension. For Gurevich, for the technicians, for the entire secret project that had consumed 200 people's lives for over a year. The origins of Projekt Lyra, Project Lyre, stretched back to the chaotic final months of World War II. On January 27, 1945, Red Army soldiers of the 1st Ukrainian Front captured the Luftwaffe's Versuchsanstalt für Flugzeugbau, VFF, a secret research facility on the outskirts of Breslau, now Wrocław, Poland. The VFF had been hidden in a former textile factory, its windows bricked up and its grounds ringed with barbed wire. Inside, the soldiers found a jumble of burned documents, broken aircraft parts, and a metal case buried under a pile of coal. The case held 47 hand-drawn blueprints for a Fliegen Untertasse flying saucer, designed by German engineer Richard Meath. The blueprints detailed a disc-shaped craft with a single jet engine mounted at its center, adjustable winglets along its rim for stability, and a cramped cockpit for one pilot. Notes scrawled in the margins claimed the saucer could reach 800 kilometers per hour, climb to 12,000 meters, and execute turns so tight they would leave Allied fighters behind. Within a week, the blueprints were flown to Moscow, where they landed on the desk of Lavrentiy Beria, head of the NKVD, Stalin's right-hand man, and overseer of all Soviet weapons research. Beria saw more than a curious Nazi experiment. He saw a chance to give the Soviet Union an edge in the post-war arms race. The U.S. and Britain were already developing jet fighters like the P-80 Shooting Star and Gloucester Meteor, a flying saucer, fast, agile, and unlike anything the West had, could make the Soviets the world's dominant air power. On March 12, 1945, Beria signed a top-secret order creating Projekt Lyra, tasking it with building and testing the Nazi-designed saucer. He hand-picked the team, Mikhail Gurevich, co-designer of the MiG-3 fighter, to lead engineering, Sergei Korolev, a rising star in aerodynamics, who would later design Sputnik, to handle flight stability, and Arkady Shvetsov, a veteran engine specialist, to adapt the saucer's power plant. Gurevich's first challenge was making sense of the Nazi blueprints. They were incomplete. Critical details like the engine's cooling system, cockpit oxygen supply, and fuel line routing were missing. Some dimensions contradicted each other. One page listed the disc diameter as 5.8 meters, another as 6.2 meters. To fill the gaps, the team spent 6 weeks cross-referencing the blueprints with captured Nazi technical reports and interviewing 3 German engineers who had worked on Meade's team. The most valuable witness was Fritz Karl, a 45-year-old aerodynamicist who had been captured during the Breslau raid. Karl revealed that the saucer's design relied on the Coanda effect, a phenomenon where air flows along curved surface, creating lift. The disk's convex shape would pull air downward, generating enough force to keep the craft aloft without traditional wings. He also admitted a fatal flaw. The only Nazi prototype, built in November 1944, had crashed 10 minutes into its first flight. Its WWII jet engine had overheated, and the saucer had spun out of control when the pilot tried to land. Beria ignored the warning. He ordered the team to build a Soviet prototype within 6 months, using the blueprints as a guide. The project was assigned to Factory Number 156 in Moscow, a sprawling complex that had previously built IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes. Work began on May 5, 1945, with 200 engineers, technicians, and metalworkers pulled from other projects. The first hurdle was materials. The Nazi blueprint specified duralumin, an aluminum-copper alloy that was lightweight but strong, ideal for high-speed aircraft. The Soviet Union produced duralumin, but in limited quantities, and most was earmarked for MiG fighters. Factory number 156 had to repurpose 12 tons of duralumin sheets, cutting them into curved sections using hydraulic presses that normally shaped IL-2 wings. Each section was 2 millimeters thick, thinner than the Nazi design's 3 millimeters, a compromise to save weight. The sections were then welded together with 1.5 mm thick seams, which were checked for leaks by pumping compressed air into the disc. A pressure of 5 atmospheres ensured no gaps. Finally, the surface was polished with abrasive pads for 40 hours per disc, reducing drag by 15%. A critical detail for reaching the saucer's target speed. The engine was even more problematic. The Nazi blueprints call for a WWII-004B, an axial flow jet engine that powered Germany's Me-262 fighter. The Soviet Union had captured 12 WWII-004Bs during the war, but most were in poor condition, for it had cracked turbine blades, 3 had clogged fuel injectors, and 1 had a melted combustion chamber. Shvetsov's team spent 3 months rebuilding the engines, replacing damaged parts with Soviet-made equivalents. They also modified the combustion chamber, increasing its volume by 10% to boost thrust from 9.8 knots to 10.5 knots, enough, they hoped, to compensate for the saucer's 3.5-ton weight. To prevent overheating, they added a second oil cooler mounted on the disk's rim, which drew air into the engine as the craft flew. The cockpit, a small pod in the center of the disk, presented its own challenges. The Nazi blueprint showed a bare-bones setup, a single seat, a speedometer, and a rudimentary steering stick. Soviet test pilots, however, insisted on more instruments. Pyotr Nesterov, who had flown 120 combat missions in IL-2s, refused to fly the saucer without an altitude gauge, a gyroscope, to prevent disorientation during turns, and a fuel level indicator. The team added the instruments, but the extra wiring and gauges added 300 kilograms to the saucer's weight. They also reinforced the cockpit with 8 mm steel armor, protecting the pilot from anti-aircraft fire, but further increasing weight. By July 1945, the team realized the saucer would be heavier than the Nazi design, 3.8 tons instead of 3.2 tons, a change that would later hurt its performance. If you found this interesting, get a thumbs up to show your support. Drop "Oh, wonderful" in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Stick around till the end, because I reveal 3 mind-blowing facts you won't want to miss. Haven't followed yet? Hit that follow button so you won't miss our next deep dive. Trust me, the best is yet to come. By December 1945, the first prototype, dubbed WWII, was ready for ground tests. It was transported by rail to Kapustin Yar, a remote test range 600 kilometers southeast of Moscow. Kapustin Yar was where the Soviet Union tested rockets and experimental aircraft, its vast steppe offering miles of uninhabited land for crashes. The first tests focused on engine performance. On December 10, 1945, the Lyra I was anchored to a concrete pad with steel cables. The WWII-004B engine was fired, and the team monitored its temperature and thrust. It ran for 25 minutes before overheating, double the Nazi prototype's lifespan, a small victory. But the test also revealed a new problem. The engine vibration caused the disc's duralumin skin to flex, creating tiny gaps between the welded sections. If left unfixed, these gaps could leak fuel or air at high altitude. The team added 12 steel ribs to the disc's interior, each 10 millimeters thick, to reinforce the skin. The ribs added another 150 kilograms, but they stopped the flexing. The first attempt to lift off took place on March 2, 1946. Nesterov climbed into the Lyra I's cockpit, his body strapped into a canvas seat with 4 leather belts. The cockpit was cramped. He could barely move his elbows, and the polished disc reflected sunlight into his eyes, forcing him to wear dark goggles. The engine roared to life, a high-pitched whine that echoed across the steppe. Nesterov slowly increased thrust, and the saucer lifted 1 meter off the ground before he cut power. "It's like sitting on a spinning top," he told Gurevich afterward. "The disc wobbles side to side. You have to fight the stick to keep it straight." Over the next 2 months, the team conducted 12 more ground tests, gradually increasing the saucer's lift to 5 meters. Each test revealed new flaws. The landing gear retracted unevenly, causing the disc to tilt. The engine stalled at speeds below 150 kilometers per hour. The winglets, meant to stabilize the craft, created drag that slowed the saucer to 350 kilometers per hour, well below the target 800 kilometers per hour. Gurevich's team revised the design. They replaced the telescoping landing gear with fixed struts, simplifying the mechanism and cutting 200 kilograms of weight. They adjusted the winglet's angle from 15 degrees to 10 degrees, reducing drag while still providing stability. They also added a small vertical tail fin, a deviation from the Nazi blueprints, to improve directional control. Korolev argued that the fin would disrupt the coanda effect, but tests prove it helped. The saucer's wobble decreased by 40%. By June 1946, the Lyra I was ready for its first short flight. On June 28, 1946, Nesterov piloted the Lyra I for a 5-minute flight. He lifted off at 10:30 a.m., climbing to 100 meters and accelerating to 200 kilometers per hour. He flew in a straight line for 2 kilometers, then turned gently and landed safely. The team cheered. It was the first time a Soviet-built flying saucer had completed a control flight. Beria, who had traveled to Kapustin Yar to witness the test, was pleased. He ordered the team to build a second prototype, the Lyra II, with a more powerful engine and larger fuel tanks. The Lyra II will be the combat-ready model, designed to reach 600 kilometers per hour and carry a 100 kilograms bomb under its belly. Work on the Lyra II began immediately. The team replaced the WWII-004B with a Soviet-built RD-10, a copy of the WWII-004B, but with an improved fuel injection system. They increased the fuel tank capacity from 300 liters to 500 liters, extending the saucer's range to 500 kilometers. They also added a small bomb rack under the disc's belly, capable of carrying a single FAB-100 high-explosive bomb. The Lyra II was completed on July 15, 1946, and transported to Capuston Yard for testing. July 18, 1946, dawned clear and hot. Perfect weather for flight tests. The team arrived at the range at 6 a.m., checking the Lyra II's engine, controls, and bomb rack. Nesterov arrived at 8 a.m., wearing his flight suit and a parachute, a new addition after the Nazi prototype crash. He climbed into the cockpit at 9:15 a.m., and the engine was fired at 9:20 a.m. The Lyra II lifted off smoothly, climbing to 500 meters and accelerating to 400 kilometers per hour. Nesterov flew in a wide circle, then attempted a gentle left turn. The disc responded sluggishly, banking 20 degrees more than he intended. He corrected with the stick, but the disc began to spin, a flat spin, where the craft rotated around its vertical axis without losing altitude. Nesterov cut power and the spin slowed, but the engine sputtered as fuel sloshed in the tank. The disc shape caused fuel to pool in one side during turns. He glided back to the range, landing hard. The nose gear collapsed, scraping the disc's front edge along the ground and damaging the engine's oil cooler. The crash revealed a fundamental flaw in the Nazi design. The disc shape made it inherently unstable at high speeds. Airflow over the curved surface created lift pockets, areas of low pressure that pulled the disc off course. The winglets and tail fin helped, but not enough to counteract the effect during sharp turns. Shvetsov's team also discovered that the RD-10 engine was underpowered. Even with a modified combustion chamber, it could only push the Lyra 2 to 550 kilometers per hour, 250 kilometers per hour, less than the Nazi blueprints claimed. The extra weight from the armor, instruments, and bomb rack had sapped the engine's power. Beria ordered the team to fix the issues, but resources were already shifting. By late 1946, the Soviet Union's military priorities had changed. Stalin wanted jet fighters, proven designs like the MiG-15 that could be mass-produced quickly. The Lyra project, with its repeated delays and uncertain performance, was deemed a luxury. The budget was cut by 50%, and half the team was reassigned to MiG production. Gurevich fought to keep the project alive, proposing a third prototype with 2 engines instead of 1. He argued that 2 RD-10s would provide enough thrust to reach 700 kilometers per hour and stabilize the disc. But Beria refused. The Soviet Union could not afford to waste time on experimental craft when it needed fighters to counter the American threat. The final test of the Lyra took place on October 5, 1946. Gurevich's team had modified the Lyra II in secret, adding a second small engine, a 1.5-can auxiliary jet, to the disc's rear. Nesterov piloted the craft for a 10-minute flight, reaching 800 meters altitude and 600 kilometers per hour. He attempted a series of gentle turns, and the disc remained stable until he tried a sharp left turn at 500 kilometers per hour. The disc spun out of control, plummeting 300 meters before Nesterov regained control by cutting the auxiliary engine. He landed safely, but the main RD-10 engine was damaged beyond repair. Gurevich wrote in his final report, "The design is fundamentally flawed. The disc cannot be made stable at combat speeds, even with 2 engines. Further work on Project Lyra is not justified." On November 12, 1946, Beria signed an order canceling Project Lyra. The Lyra I and Lyra II were disassembled at Kapustin Yar, their derailment sheets sent to factory number 156 to build MiG-15s. The Nazi blueprints were filed away in the NKVD's Moscow archives, marked top secret, not for further development. Gurevich was reassigned to lead MiG-17 development. Korolev focused on rocket research, and Shvetsov returned to designing engines for bombers. The flying saucer, once hailed as the future of Soviet air power, was forgotten. The captured Nazi blueprints that inspired Project Lyra had their own hidden history. Richard Meade, the German engineer who designed the original flying saucer, had fled to Argentina in May 1945, taking copies of complete blueprints with him. He later claimed the Nazi prototype had been intended to carry a single bomb, but the Luftwaffe had canceled the project in 1944 due to fuel shortages and the engine overheating issue. The blueprints the Soviets captured were incomplete. Meade had omitted key details about the engine's cooling system and a stabilizer ring that had been added to the prototype before its crash. This explained why the Lyra struggled. The Soviet team had been working with a flawed, partial design. Meade would later try to sell his complete blueprints to the Argentine government, but nothing came of it. He died in 1958, his flying saucer design unbuilt. In the decades after the war, Project Lyra remained classified. Soviet leaders feared that revealing they had copied a Nazi weapon, even a failed one, would damage their image as a self-sufficient, technologically advanced nation. It was not until 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the project's files were declassified. Historians found them in the archives of the Russian Ministry of Defense, tucked between reports on rocket tests and jet fighter development. The files included Gurevich's test reports, Korolev's aerodynamic calculations, and even photographs of the Lyra 1 and Lyra 2 on the Kapustin Yar tarmac. Today, only fragments of the Lyra survive. A 30-centimeter piece of the Lyra 2's duralumin skin, scored from its final crash landing, is on display at the Central Museum of the Russian Air Force in Menino, outside Moscow. The skin's polished surface still reflects light, and a small plaque explains its origins. Fragment of Project Lyra flying saucer, 1946. Built from captured Nazi designs, this prototype tested the limits of Soviet aeronautical engineering. The Nazi blueprints, their edges frayed from decades of storage, are kept in a climate-controlled vault at the Russian State Military Archive in Moscow. Researchers can view them by special permission, but photography is forbidden. The Lyra's technical legacy is minimal, but its lessons are lasting. It taught the Soviet Union's weapons designers to question capture technology, to verify every detail, not just copy it. The team's reliance on incomplete Nazi blueprints led to avoidable mistakes, from the underpowered engine to the unstable flight characteristics. After Project Lyra, the Soviet military prioritized original designs, investing in research that would lead to the MiG-21, Sputnik, and the Soyuz spacecraft. The saucer also highlighted the limits of exotic aircraft shapes. While disc-shaped craft offer theoretical advantages in lift and speed, they require advanced control systems to remain stable, technology the Soviet Union lacked in 1946. It would take until the 1980s, with the development of fly-by-wire systems, for flying saucers to become even remotely practical, and even then, they remained experimental. For Mikhail Gurevich, Project Lyra was a brief, frustrating detour in a career defined by success. He would go on to co-design the MiG-15, which outperformed American fighters in the Korean War, and the MiG-21, one of the most widely used fighters in history. In a 1972 interview with a Soviet aviation magazine, he rarely mentioned the flying saucer, but when pressed, he said, "We learned more from Lyra's failures than from our successes. It taught us to never take a design, even a revolutionary one, at face value. You have to test every assumption, every detail. The story of the Soviet Union's World War II flying saucer is a cautionary tale about ambition and haste. The Soviets wanted to turn a Nazi relic into a weapon of post-war power, but they ignored the gaps of the design and the limitations of their own industrial capacity. The Lyra was a machine built on hope. Hope that a captured blueprint could shortcut years of research. Hope that a strange, disc-shaped craft could outmatch proven fighters. Hope that the scraps of World War II technology could shape the future. As visitors to the Central Museum of the Russian Air Force stand before the Lyra skin fragment, they often wonder what might have been. If the Nazi blueprints had been complete, if the Soviet Union had had more powerful engines, if the disc had been more stable, would the flying saucer have changed the Cold War? The answer is almost certainly no. The Lyra was a curiosity, not a breakthrough. It lacked the range, speed, and reliability of traditional fighters, and it would have been expensive to mass produce. Even if it had worked, it would have been obsolete within a decade, replaced by faster, more agile jets. The Soviet Union's World War II flying saucer was never more than a test-range prototype, a machine built from borrowed dreams and incomplete plans. It failed to fly well, failed to impress military leaders, and failed to change the course of history. But in its failure, it taught a valuable lesson. True technological advantage comes not from copying others, but from understanding the science behind designs and knowing when to abandon a bad idea. Today, Kapustin Yar is still a test range, though it now focuses on modern missiles and drones. The steppe where the Lyra once wobbled into the sky is quiet, the dust still blowing across the empty land. The flying saucer is gone, but its story remains, a footnote in WWII's race for strange weapons, a reminder how even the boldest technological gambles can crash back to Earth.